Barring the obvious exception of slavery, America seemed to be a land of equality and opportunity when compared to the stratified societies of Europe. The vast majority of Americans were small farmers that had to toil to live a hand to mouth existence. A small but growing class of skilled artisans, small business owners, and tradespeople were also beginning to grow in urban areas. The most unique feature of the social structure of British North America was its openness. It was a place that was quickly becoming identified as a land of opportunity where one could advance themselves. Indentured servants could elevate themselves as freemen to plantation owners with the right ambition. Yet several conditions and events of the 18th century led to greater social stratification as the colonies neared the American Revolution. This segment will review why it was more difficult to climb the social ladder in the 18th century than it was in the 17th. War in Europe and the American colonies at the turn of the 18th century created some of the greatest wealth and the deepest poverty. New England was quickly becoming the shipping center of the British Empire, and the transportation of war material created a small class of merchant elites. Elements of aristocracy broke through egalitarian New England as church pews and school desks were assigned according to a family's wealth. By 1750, the richest 10% of New Englanders owned nearly 66% of the colony's wealth. Conversely, war created a class of widows and orphans. Because women were limited in their opportunity to make a living, widows who did not remarry risked financial insecurity. Cities like New York and Philadelphia created almshouses for homeless women and children. Land shortages also made it difficult for the ambitious poor to elevate themselves where a century earlier this problem did not exist. Even in New England, which had developed later and slower than other regions of the colonies, was running out of unclaimed soil. Landholding families subdivided their land as population density grew and farm sizes diminished. To make financial ends meet, New England farmers were forced to hire out their children as waged laborers. Some took their chances squatting on land west of the Alleghenies. Like New York and Philadelphia, Boston eventually established its own public charity for the homeless poor, which the Puritans forced to wear large red peas as a form of shame and as a sign that they were welfare recipients. The social stratification, being caused by a lack of arable land, had been felt in the South since before the time of Nathaniel Bacon. Through the 18th century, the wealthy planter elites met their needs for new land by buying out the farmer class, who found it increasingly difficult to make a living off the prices of crops that were driven low by plantation agriculture, fed by slave labor. Without land of their own, poor whites were resigned to rent land from plantation owners or work alongside of black slaves as tenant farmers. Despite land shortages, the ranks of the lower classes in America's society swelled in the 18th century due to a continuing stream of indentured servants. While most of these men came voluntarily, nearly 50,000 were shipped to British North America by the King's government. Debtors, robbers, murderers, and rapists were sent to toil for American headrights. While many of these arrivals were riffraff, some became highly respectable citizens. In fact, two signers of the Declaration of Independence got their start as indentured servants. Least fortunate of all were the African slaves, representing about 20% of the colony's population. These men and women had nearly no chance to climb the social ladder of British North American society, especially after slave codes were adopted at the beginning of the 18th century. Events like the New York Slave Revolt and Stono's Rebellion caused some efforts to curb the importation of black slaves. But as we saw was the case in South Carolina, Fears of a violent slave uprising took a back seat to the fears of losing a supply of cheap labor for the colonies. Suspensions and prohibitions on the importing of slaves were always lifted. Even Georgia, which had banned slavery when it was founded, legalized it by 1751 by royal decree. Opposition to the existence of slavery blamed the British monarchy for its institution. Even Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, assailed the Crown's efforts to veto bans on slavery in his Declaration of Independence. Ultimately, though, Jefferson was forced to remove these criticisms in a final draft because of a torrent of criticism by Southern slave masters. But truth be told, the institution of slavery was not just valuable to the South. New England merchants became fabulously wealthy transporting slaves from the West Indies to Charleston. A South Carolina advertisement for slaves in the 1760s. Note the reference to these slaves' origins on the West African's rice coast, a reminder of South Carolina's reliance on African skills and labor for rice cultivation. Note, too, that half of the slaves were said to have survived smallpox, and thus they had acquired an immunity from further infection.